Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. And yet another concerning sign that officials fear the previously anticipated consumption rebound will not be enough to sustain politically acceptable growth levels in 2023. Local government infrastructure spending is once again surging this year. As regular viewers know, much of this debt-financed infrastructure spending we have seen over the last 5 years has primarily been used as a tool by local governments to top up economic activity when healthy growth, that is, consumption, private non-housing investment and exports, is not enough. Many of these projects have much lower or even negative productivity gains versus 10 to 20 years ago. Today, US financial media outlet Bloomberg writes, based on analysis of government statistics and state media reports, that Chinese provinces plan to boost spending on major construction projects by almost a fifth this year. Quote, as Beijing continues to rely on infrastructure to spur an economy being hindered by consumers still bruised from years of pandemic restrictions. End quote. About 2/3 of China's regions, reports the outlet, have announced spending plans for major projects such as transport infrastructure, energy generation and industrial parks this year, adding up to more than 12.2 trillion yuan, $1.8 trillion, a 17% increase year on year. This, quote, underscores Beijing's reliance on a tested strategy of using investment to drive employment and eventually household incomes, end quote, rather than directly subsidizing households. Quote, at least in the first half of the year, there's going to be a strong growth in fixed asset investment. The government's hope is that drives the recovery, and at some point they can hand over the baton to private business and consumption. I think that is the plan, end quote. Of course, there are several implications of all this. Beijing's efforts to deal with local government debt will be frustrated, or at least slowed, by this extra fiscal pressure. Construction will once again boost global commodity demand, especially for oil, coal and iron ore, and growth may end up meeting the government's goal of over 5% this year, but it will be achieved through arguably unhealthy infrastructure spending rather than more sustainable consumption. The Bloomberg analysts also point out a theme which we have been following for some time on China Update: regional disparities in infrastructure spending, with poorer regions seeing the biggest increases relative to their economic size. This shouldn't be surprising. If infrastructure spending is a tool to supplement growth, as I have argued, then healthier and wealthier cities and regions have less need for such supplementation. Quote, regions with unusually large targets for major projects include the poor central province of Henan, which plans to increase spending by nearly 50% this year to 2 trillion yuan. Only one province, wealthy, Zhejiang in eastern China, announced a fall in spending this year, forecasting a 9% drop to 1 trillion yuan. End quote. Meanwhile, the China State Railway Group announced on Sunday that total railway investment in the first 3 months of this year hit 113.55 billion RMB, $16.5 billion, up by 6.6% year on year, the highest first quarter investment in the past decade. More construction is to come later this year, with the state railway operator explaining it will focus on the construction of projects in border areas in the lightly populated, politically less stable western regions, as well as along the new Western Land Sea Corridor, a trade and logistics chain connecting Western China and Southeast Asia. Quote, railway projects are key infrastructure projects controlled by the state, and the pacing up in implementation represents fiscal support for economic growth. Therefore, I see it as an active fiscal policy to ensure steady growth, to let investment spur the economy. End quote. Other commentators are more critical, however. Quote, even for those most determined to justify unlimited railway spending in China, this must be worrying. It is a little hard to believe that China is more underinvested in railway today than it has been in the past 10 years, but unless you believe that, it is hard to explain why China needs so much more railway investment this year than in the past. Few Chinese economists still believe the railway spending is done for any other than political reasons. Railway projects are key infrastructure projects controlled by the state and represent fiscal support for economic growth, as one prominent economist has said. Says another, railway projects in these remote border areas will definitely lose money, but for a vast country with so many neighbours, we also need them to move troops or material rapidly because of defence needs. End quote. On this point, next up, China's military drills around Taiwan heat up. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribing and sharing is also a huge help. For anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Yesterday, Monday, was day 3 of the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command's military exercises around Taiwan in response to Tsai Ing-wen's recent US trips. While analysts agree the exercises are not as big as the post-Pelosi trip drills last year, they are certainly not small and have escalated day by day. According to state media, the first day of the exercises focused on, quote, testing the task force capabilities and seizing the control of the sea, air and information under the support of the Joint Combat System, end quote. On the second day, the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command carried out, quote, simulated joint precision strikes on key targets on the island of Taiwan and its surrounding waters, keeping the suppressive situation in which the island is encircled, end quote. On Monday, yesterday, day 3 of the exercises, the Joint Staff of Japan's Self-Defense Forces, which follows these kinds of developments very closely for obvious reasons, said that the Chinese Navy had conducted 120 flight sorties from an aircraft carrier over the previous 3 days. Fighter aircraft took off and landed 80 times on China's second aircraft carrier, the Shandong, with 40 flights being conducted by helicopters. Japan's so-called Air Self-Defense Force, a de facto air force, scrambled jets in response to the PLA movements. Tokyo urged Beijing to stop its Coast Guard ships entering Japanese waters too, with a Foreign Ministry statement expressing, quote, we conveyed our deep concerns over the situation in the East and South China Seas and reiterated the importance of having peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, end quote. Also yesterday, on Monday, China's Eastern Theater Command said that its units involved were practicing a joint blockade of Taiwan and released video footage of fighters taking off from a carrier. We have followed these last 3 days of exercises. How do they compare to last year's large-scale exercises after Pelosi's trip? In both cases, large numbers of aircraft were used, with dozens crossing the unofficial median line between Taiwan and the mainland. One key difference is that last year, the PLA fired at least 12 missiles into the sea off Taiwan, with some splashing into Japanese territorial waters. This time, however, PLA analyst Ben Lewis argues that the Chinese military's abilities have evolved, observing that this time Chinese J-15 jets, designed to operate from aircraft carriers, have been tracked entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone for the first time. State media has produced a series of commentaries justifying Beijing's actions. For example, this one from the leading People's Daily. Quote, while the DPP authorities take every opportunity to conduct separatist activities for Taiwan independence out of selfish political gains, the US has wantedly used Taiwan as a pawn to contain China in total disregard of the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and the fundamental interests of the people of Taiwan. By firmly rejecting the US provocations on the Taiwan question, China is saying no to the US hegemony and bullying and upholding international fairness and justice, which is why China's action has been supported by the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. The Chinese people have the resolve, the will, and the ability to defend their national sovereignty and territorial integrity. They must and will realize the historic goal of reunifying their motherland. End quote. Military outlet the PLA Daily was even more unambiguous. Quote, what's even more shocking is that the DPP authority is also deliberately ingratiated towards the preposterous destruction of Taiwan plan of the American politicians and makes the Taiwan people the cannon fodder to contain China with Taiwan. End quote. Over the weekend, the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced sanctions on the Hudson Institute and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and their directors for hosting Taiwan's Taiwan. Meanwhile, UK-based Reuters reports that Taiwanese are rushing to buy patches being worn by their Air Force pilots that depict a Formosan black bear punching Winnie the Pooh in the face, quote, as a defiant symbol of the island's resistance to Chinese war games, end quote. Beijing's drills are now officially concluded. Life in Taiwan appears to be continuing as normal and civilian flights operating as usual. Though, as we discussed in Saturday's video, surveys of Taiwanese adults suggest a deep concern over the military exercises and the worsening state of affairs over the Taiwan Strait. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.